"You're just a cook." Those were the last 4 words Clara's wealthy Korean husband said before walking out on their 5th wedding anniversary. She thought he was choosing work over her. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, Clara attended the luxury restaurant launch his company had spent years building. The room applauded as the celebrity chef unveiled the dish that would save the company. Clara took one bite and almost dropped her fork. It wasn't inspired by her cooking. It wasn't similar to her recipe. It was her mother's secret recipe. The handwritten recipe her grandmother had protected for generations. The notebook she'd hidden inside her own home. Across the room, her husband stood smiling and clapping, completely unaware that his wife had just discovered someone had stolen the most precious thing she'd ever owned. Then, as Clara walked away trying to hold herself together, she found a company proposal lying open beside the elevators. And printed across the top was the exact secret name she'd given that recipe years before. A name no one else in the world was ever supposed to know. Before we uncover who stole Clara's family recipe and whether her own husband betrayed her, comment where you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the anniversary dinner and the 4 words that quietly destroyed a marriage. Clara Jenkins stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, watching the sauce thicken the way her grandmother taught her. Low heat, patience. Never rush what needs time. She'd made this recipe exactly 3 times in her life, once for her mother, right before she passed, once for herself, the night she decided to move to Korea, for a man she loved more than she trusted her own judgment, and now, tonight, for their 5th anniversary. She wanted it to mean something. Tae-yung came home late, the way he always did lately, his tie already loosened, his phone still lit up in his hand. He kissed her cheek without really looking at her, the kind of kiss that's more habit than feeling, and sat down at the table she'd set with the good plates, the ones they never used. "Smells good," he said, already scrolling. "Taste it before you decide that," she said, half smiling, sliding a spoonful toward him. He tasted it. For half a second, something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe. Recognition. Like his body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then his phone buzzed again, and whatever that look was, it disappeared. "I have to go back in," he said, standing, already reaching for his jacket. "Emergency board thing. I'm sorry. Tae-yung, it's our anniversary." I know, Clara. I'll make it up to you." He wasn't really listening. He was thinking about numbers, about a company that had been bleeding money for 2 years, about a father who'd built something from nothing and left him terrified of being the one who lost it. Can't someone else handle it? Just tonight? He stopped at the door, and for a second she thought he might turn around, might choose her instead of the meeting, might finally choose her. Instead he sighed, the kind of sigh a person gives when they think they're the only one working hard. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said. "You're just a cook. You don't have to worry about any of this." He didn't mean it the way it landed. He meant it about the meeting, about the pressure, about wanting to protect her from a world he thought would eat her alive. But words don't care what you meant. They only care what they sound like when they leave your mouth. Clara didn't say anything. She just watched the door close behind him, the sauce going cold on the stove, 5 years of small moments folding quietly into that one sentence. She sat down at the table set for 2 and ate alone. 3 floors below their apartment, in an office that never really slept, Seo Do-hwan was running his fingers over a printed page with numbers that didn't add up the way they should. He'd tasted a sample of something new that week, something Clara had made for a family dinner months back, and he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since. The balance of it, the way it tasted like someone's whole life had gone into it. He ordered 3 more samples that night, quietly, through an assistant who didn't ask questions. He told himself Tae-yung already knew about Clara's gift. Everyone in that family had to know. He was wrong, and it would cost all of them more than he understood yet. 2 weeks later, Clara stood in the middle of a hotel ballroom she didn't want to be in, wearing a dress Tae-yung had picked out for her, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. The luxury restaurant launch was everything she expected. Lights, cameras, important people saying important things about heritage and innovation. Then the signature dish came out. She almost laughed at first. It smelled exactly right. Too exactly right. She took one bite, just to be sure, and her stomach dropped somewhere she couldn't reach. It was her sauce. Her mother's sauce. The one she'd made 3 times in her whole life. Applause rippled through the room as the head chef stepped forward to take a bow. Some rising star named Na Yo-rin, praised as a genius, as visionary, as the future of Korean fine dining. Clara set her fork down very quietly. Across the room, Tae-yung was clapping along with everyone else, smiling the polite smile of a man doing his job, completely unaware that his wife had just watched a stranger take credit for a piece of her heart. Clara left before dessert. Nobody noticed. That was becoming a pattern. She walked past the coat check, past the valet stand, and that's when she saw it. A folder left open on a side table near the elevators, forgotten in the chaos of the launch. A company proposal, a working menu title. She almost kept walking, almost. Something made her stop. The name on the page was written in careful English letters, the exact name she had given her recipe years ago, back when she first wrote it in her own notebook, back before any of this began. Her hand went still on the folder. Her fingers stayed pressed against the folder for a long moment before she made herself move. Someone could come around that corner any second, and she couldn't be caught standing here like a thief in her own husband's world. She slid the folder closed and walked to the elevator on legs that didn't quite feel like hers. By the time she got home, she'd already decided something. She wasn't going to walk into their bedroom and demand answers. She wasn't going to throw the name of her mother's recipe in Tae-yung's face and watch his expression to see if he flinched. Because if he didn't know, she'd have humiliated him for nothing. And if he did know, she wanted proof before she gave him the chance to explain it away. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with her old notebook open in front of her, the pages soft and worn from years of use, and she went through it line by line, like she was meeting it for the first time. That was when she noticed it. A faint discoloration along the spine, a slight bend in certain pages that hadn't been there before. Someone had opened this book flat, hard, the way you do when you're photographing something and need it to stay still. Her stomach turned. This wasn't a memory someone had stolen from watching her cook. This was documentation. Someone had gone through her notebook page by page. She thought back. 6 months ago, maybe 7. She'd left it on the kitchen counter for 2 days while she visited her friend Imani, convinced it was safe in her own home, because why wouldn't it be? Across the city, Tae-yung sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a spreadsheet that told him what he already knew. The company his father built was 3/4 away from serious trouble. The board wanted the restaurant launch pushed forward, faster, bigger, with recipes that would make headlines. He'd approved it 2 weeks ago, before the launch, before any of this. He told himself it didn't matter where inspiration came from. Every kitchen borrowed from somewhere. That was how food worked, wasn't it? Nobody owned a flavor. But some small, honest part of him knew that wasn't the whole truth, and he pushed that part down the way he always did, because there were 4,000 employees counting on him, and he didn't have the luxury of guilt right now. He noticed Clara had gone quiet lately. Shorter answers, longer silences over breakfast. He told himself it was probably her monthly visit to her mother's grave coming up, or exhaustion, or one of a dozen things that had nothing to do with him. He didn't ask. Asking meant making time he didn't have, and some part of him was relieved not to. That relief would cost him more than he knew. 2 days later, Clara sat across from Imani at a small cafe near the river, stirring a coffee she hadn't touched, and Imani watched her with the kind of attention only a lifelong friend gives. "You've been somewhere else for 20 minutes, Imani said. "You want to tell me, or you want me to guess?" Clara almost laughed. "You'd guess wrong. Try me." So Clara told her. The dish, the name. The pages in her notebook that had been opened and photographed by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Imani's jaw tightened. And you haven't said anything to him? What am I supposed to say? Hey, I think someone in your company stole from me, and I don't know if it was you? Clara, Imani leaned forward. You've spent 5 years making yourself smaller, so nobody would think you married him for his money. And now somebody's about to make millions off the one thing that's actually yours, and you're worried about being polite. That landed harder than Clara expected. She looked down at her coffee, at her own reflection wobbling on the surface. There's an international competition, Imani said, softer now. Applications close in 3 weeks. You don't need his name on anything. You don't need permission. You just need to cook, the way you always have, and let people see it's you. Clara didn't answer right away. Something in her chest that had been closed for a long time creaked open, just slightly. She was still turning the idea over when her phone buzzed with a message from Seo Do-hwan, a name she barely recognized outside company dinners. Can we talk? Somewhere private. It's about your recipes. Her hands went cold around the phone. They met the next evening in a quiet tea house, 2 streets from company headquarters, away from cameras, away from anyone who might report back to the board. Seo Do-hwan looked older than she remembered, his shoulders carrying something heavier than his years. He slid a folder across the table, thinner than the one she'd seen at the launch, but she recognized the layout immediately. Recipe notes. Her handwriting, copied almost exactly, dated months before the launch. I should have said something sooner, he said. I told myself it wasn't my place. Clara stared at the pages, her own words staring back at her in someone else's neat corporate formatting. Who did this? That's not the question that matters most right now. He folded his hands together, choosing his words the way a man chooses steps across thin ice. Your husband never stole your recipe. I need you to understand that clearly. Relief moved through her, quick and unguarded, before his next words caught it and pulled it back down. But he did make a choice, Seo Do-hwan said quietly. That may hurt even more than if he had. What choice? Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Seo Do-hwan reached into his jacket and pulled out a second item. An envelope yellowed at the edges, sealed with a wax stamp she recognized from old family documents. Tae-yung's father's seal. He wrote this almost 2 years before he passed, Seo Do-hwan said. He asked me to give it to you if the day ever came when you needed to understand why things happened the way they did. I told myself that day hadn't come yet. I was wrong. It came a long time ago. Clara looked at the envelope like it might burn her fingers. Does Tae-yung know you have this? He knows it exists. He's never asked me to give it to you. He paused. I think some part of him hoped he'd never have to. She took it home without opening it. She sat with it on the kitchen table for an hour, the same table where 5 years of dinners had grown quieter and quieter, and she thought about every version of the truth that letter could hold. Maybe it would say her husband never loved her at all. Maybe it would say something worse, something she couldn't even imagine yet. She opened it anyway, because not knowing had already cost her enough. The handwriting inside was careful, formal, a father writing the way men of his generation wrote when they meant every word. He wrote about tasting something Clara had made years earlier, at a small family gathering nobody thought mattered. He wrote that in 30 years of running restaurants, he had rarely tasted anything with that much honesty in it. He wrote that he believed, quietly and completely, that Clara held something the company had been missing since long before she arrived. Not an employee, not a resource, a gift. And then, near the bottom, one line that made her hand go still. I worry my son sees gold and doesn't recognize it, because he was raised to look only at numbers. Please be patient with him. He will understand what he has before he loses it, or he will lose it first and understand after. I hope, for both your sakes, it is the first. Clara sat with that sentence for a long time. Before we find out which one it was, I want to know where you're watching this from tonight. Drop your city in the comments, because what happens next will change everything between them. The door opened behind her, before she'd even folded the letter back into its envelope. Tae-yung stood in the entryway, still in his coat, his face already carrying the look of a man who'd rehearsed something on the drive home and lost his nerve twice. "Seo Do-hwan called me," he said. "He told me he gave it to you." Clara didn't stand. She didn't hide the letter either. "Your father thought I could save the company, and you knew that. This whole time, you knew that, and you never said one word." "I was going to tell you." His voice cracked slightly on the word tell, an unfamiliar sound coming from a man who never let his voice do that. "I kept waiting for the right moment, and there was never a right moment, so I just kept waiting." "That's not an answer." "I know." He finally crossed the room and sat across from her, closer than he'd sat in weeks. "I was afraid, Clara. If I told you what he believed about you, what would that make me? The husband who only married the woman who could save his father's company? I couldn't stand you looking at me and wondering if any of this was ever real. So instead you let me believe I was invisible. You let some stranger take my name off my own recipe, rather than risk me questioning yours." He flinched like she'd struck him, because in a way she had. "I didn't approve that launch because I wanted to erase you," he said. "I approved it because 4,000 families needed paychecks, and I was drowning. And I told myself it didn't matter where the recipes came from, as long as everyone survived. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I've known it since I watched you walk out of that ballroom, and I didn't even go after you." Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding, and that understanding hurt in a different way than anger did. "The recipe isn't the betrayal, Tae-yung." Her voice was quiet now, which somehow felt heavier than if she'd shouted. "You are. Every day you decided not to trust me with the truth. You decided I wasn't someone you could lean on. Not the company. Not your father's memory. Me." He didn't defend himself. He just reached into his coat and pulled out one more envelope, smaller, still sealed, and set it on the table between them, instead of in her hands. "There's more," he said. "Another letter. I never opened it. I was too afraid of what it might ask of me." Clara looked at the envelope, then at him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she realized she didn't need his permission to find out what it said. She didn't touch it that night. Instead, 3 days later, sitting alone in the quiet of her kitchen while Tae-yung worked late, trying to hold his company together, Clara opened her laptop and read the application details for the international culinary competition Imani had mentioned. Entries closed in 10 days. Winners were expected to relocate for a 6-month residency if selected. She filled out every field. She wrote her name, her own name, nothing borrowed and nothing hidden. She submitted it before she could talk herself out of it, and she didn't tell Tae-yung a single word. The confirmation email arrived 4 days later. Clara stared at the subject line for a full minute before opening it. "Congratulations," it read. "You have been selected to compete." She sat with her hand over her mouth, not sure if the sound trying to come out of her was a laugh or something closer to tears. Somebody, somewhere, had tasted her work without knowing her name, without knowing whose wife she was, and they had chosen her anyway. She thought about calling Tae-yung. She didn't. Instead, she called a lawyer the next morning, a friend of Imani's who specialized in intellectual property, and sat in a small office listening to him explain exactly how strong her case would be. Documented notebook, timeline of access, a recipe that predated the restaurant launch by years. He told her a lawsuit could shut the whole project down and win her a settlement that would set her up for life. Clara listened to every word, and then she shook her head. "I don't want to destroy it," she said. "I want to win it, on a stage, with my own name on it, where everyone can see." The lawyer looked at her like she'd said something foolish. Maybe she had. But for the first time in years, the decision felt entirely hers. Word of the leaked notebook photographs reached Elias Grant before it reached most of the board. He'd been circling the restaurant launch for weeks, drawn by something that never quite added up in Na Yo-rin's interviews. The way she talked about inspiration in vague, careful language instead of specifics. When a source inside the company quietly sent him a comparison of Clara's handwriting against the official recipe files, he knew he had his story. He published 2 days before the competition Clara had entered was set to air internationally. The headline didn't hold back. Stolen Heritage: How a Luxury Restaurant Built Its Menu on One Woman's Unclaimed Recipes. The company's phones didn't stop ringing. Investors who had been quietly nervous about the launch's costs suddenly had a much louder reason to panic. 3 pulled their funding within hours. Employees who had spent months preparing for opening night whispered in hallways about layoffs, about the possibility the whole project might collapse before it opened. Na Yo-rin was the one who finally spoke, standing in front of cameras she hadn't asked for, her voice tighter than her practiced composure usually allowed. The inspiration for several dishes came from Clara Jenkins, she said. I should have said her name from the beginning. I didn't, because I was afraid of what it would cost me. She paused, and something almost defiant crossed her face. But I want to be clear. This didn't happen because one person is dishonest. It happened because this company built a culture where staying quiet was safer than telling the truth. I was part of that. So was everyone above me. Tae-yung watched the broadcast from his office, his father's old chair beneath him, and made the only decision that felt like it belonged to him anymore. He halted the launch completely. Not postponed. Halted. The board called an emergency session within the hour, demanding to know how he intended to save a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He stood in front of them, the same men who had trusted his father for 30 years, and told them the truth for the first time since any of this began. We built something on a woman's work and let her disappear behind it, he said. I let that happen because I was protecting the wrong thing. I'm not doing it again, no matter what it costs us. Before you find out what the board decided, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because Clara's biggest moment was still ahead of her, and it would change everything neither of them expected. 3 nights later, Clara stood under stage lights in a kitchen built for competition, ingredients laid out in front of her, cameras from a dozen countries pointed her way. She hadn't told Tae-yung the exact date. She hadn't told him much of anything lately, but somehow, watching a live broadcast alone in a hotel room across the ocean, she felt lighter than she had in years. She cooked the way her mother taught her. Patience, low heat, nothing rushed. When the judges tasted her final dish, one of them, a woman with decades of experience and very little patience for sentiment, set down her fork and simply said, "This tastes like someone's whole life." Clara felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected anyone to understand that without her having to explain it. The scores came in high enough to secure her a place in the finals, but it wasn't the numbers that undid her. It was the audience rising to their feet, applauding not a brand, not a company, but her, standing there in her own name for the first time since she'd left her mother's kitchen years ago. Tears blurred the lights into soft gold rings, and she let them fall without hiding her face. Back in Korea, Tae-yung watched the broadcast from his father's old office, and something inside him finally broke loose from wherever he'd been holding it. He submitted his resignation to the board the next morning, before they could vote him out over the losses from the halted launch. He didn't fight it. He didn't ask for time. He simply signed the papers, walked out of the building that had defined his entire adult life, and got on a flight without telling anyone where he was going. Clara was packing her things in her hotel room 3 days later, still riding the quiet disbelief of everything that had happened, when there was a knock at her door. She opened it, expecting hotel staff. Instead, she found Tae-yung standing in the hallway, tired in a way she'd never seen him, holding out toward her the one thing she thought she'd lost for good: her grandmother's notebook, the pages worn soft with years of use, the cover slightly bent from being handled by hands other than her own. "I found it," he said quietly, "in the archive where it was photographed. I thought you should have it back before you decide anything else without me." Clara didn't take the notebook right away. She looked at it in his hands, then at him, and let the silence stretch long enough that he almost pulled it back. "Why now?" she said. "Why not before any of this happened? Because before, I thought giving things to you was the same as loving you." He set the notebook gently on the small table by the door, instead of forcing it into her hands. I bought you a kitchen you never asked for. I built you a life I thought you'd be grateful for. I never once asked what you actually wanted, because asking meant admitting I didn't already know. And now? Now I'm just standing here. No company, no title, nothing to offer you except the truth, which I should have given you 5 years ago." He looked down at his own hands, empty in a way they had never been in front of her before. "I'm not asking you to come home, Clara. I don't think I've earned that yet. I just needed you to have this back." She picked up the notebook slowly, feeling the familiar weight of it settle into her palms, and something in her chest loosened that had been tight for months. "I'm not the same person who left," she said. "I know. I'm not asking you to be." She didn't invite him in that night. But she didn't close the door either, and for two people who had spent years mistaking silence for peace, leaving a door slightly open said more than either of them could have managed in words. The company Tae-yung had built his life around offered to reinstate him within the month, once the panic settled and investors realized the story had actually made the brand more human, not less. He turned them down. He told the board he'd only return if every dish born from Clara's notebook carried her name publicly, permanently, in ink no one could quietly edit out later. They didn't like it. They agreed anyway, because they needed him more than he needed them. Seo Do-hwan did something none of them expected. He released a set of old recordings from the archive, Tae-young's father speaking into a tape recorder years before his death, his voice rough with age but certain in every word. He spoke of tasting Clara's cooking for the first time. He spoke of writing to his son about it, and never being sure if the letter reached where it needed to. He said, plainly, that if his company had a future worth trusting, it would be built on the kind of honesty Clara carried in her hands, without even knowing its value. Clara heard the recording sitting beside Imani, and she cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since her mother passed. Not from grief this time, but from finally being seen by someone who never got the chance to say it to her face. 6 months later, the company opened its doors again, not to a luxury restaurant with someone else's name on the door, but to a culinary institute built to train young cooks who had talent and no way to prove it. They named it after her. Na Yo-rin was there, on opening day, not as an executive chef chasing a title, but as a mentor, standing quietly at the back of the room, having asked for nothing more than the chance to teach what she'd learned about honesty the hard way. Clara walked through the new kitchen the morning before the opening ceremony, running her hand along counters that smelled like fresh paint and possibility, and found Tae-yung already there, standing on a small step stool, hanging something on the wall. She stopped in the doorway and watched him work in silence, the way she used to watch him from a distance, without either of them noticing the gap between them. It was a framed menu, the very first dish she'd ever created for their anniversary dinner, all those years ago, printed clean and simple, her full name beneath the title where a chef's name should always have been. He stepped down and looked at her, waiting, the way a man waits when he genuinely doesn't know the answer. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted people to see it every day, not as an apology, as the truth." He paused. "You were never just a cook, Clara. You never were. I just didn't have the courage to say it until I almost lost you." She walked closer, close enough to see the small tremor still in his hands, close enough to remember every version of him she'd loved and every version that had hurt her, and she realized she didn't need him to be perfect anymore. She only needed him to be honest, and finally, painfully, he was. "We start over as equals," she said. "Not because you're giving me something, because I already earned my place here on my own." "I know," he said. "That's the only way I want it now." That evening, after the institute had emptied and the lights had dimmed to a soft gold, Clara cooked for him in the new kitchen. The same recipe from their anniversary years before, made with the same patience her grandmother taught her. This time he sat and watched every step, asking questions instead of glancing at his phone, tasting slowly instead of rushing toward the door. When he finally took a bite, he closed his eyes for a long moment, and what came out of him wasn't a compliment or an apology. It was simply, "Thank you for letting me taste this again." Months later, while sorting through the last of his father's belongings in the old family house, Clara found a worn notebook tucked behind a shelf of cookbooks, its pages filled with dozens of unfinished recipes in a hand she didn't recognize until she turned to the final page. A short note, written not long before he passed, addressed to both of them. The next chapter belongs to the two of you. Clara held the notebook against her chest and looked over at Tae-yung, who had come to stand beside her without either of them noticing the other move. For the first time since she had said yes to him all those years ago, she believed, completely and without doubt, that whatever came next, they would build it together.